Hi, I'm at Manitoba Ag Days. I'm here with John Gavloski, Manitoba entomologist with Manitoba Agriculture. John, you did your yearly insect talk here at Ag Days. Today you particularly focused on one insect called the cabbage pod.
Cabbage seed pod weevil.
Cabbage seed pod
yes.
weevil, thank you very much. Why is that something that stood out in your radar this past year?
Yeah, so the talk I was doing was part of Canola Morning, where we have a canola focus. We actually covered 6 different insects in canola. However, the one that really stood out was cabbage seed pod weevil, mainly because it's something new for most growers. It's something they hadn't really had to deal with before in Manitoba. Saskatchewan and Alberta have. We haven't. It's an insect that the adults move into canola when it's flowering. They are attracted to the color yellow. They move in when it's flowering. They're laying their eggs onto the young, just forming pods. Little larvae get right inside the pod and they feed on the seeds. So that's why they're an issue. The other thing that's really inconvenient is in order to manage them, you would have to be spraying for them in a flowering canola crop, which is not great. And I'll get back to that. But the reason that it was such a big issue this year, we've been surveying for this since 2017 when it was first found in Manitoba. And until this past year, the levels stayed actually quite low, to the point where we knew we had it, but it was at well below economic threshold levels. All of a sudden, last year, we did have economic populations. So when I say economic, the threshold is 25 to 40 in 10 sweeps with a sweep net. We were getting some populations over double the economic threshold.
Okay.
So all of a sudden in 1 year, you've gone from well below threshold to above, at least in some fields. That's why it's a big issue. And back to the spraying part, one of these challenges in canola, I always advise farmers that you really don't want a canola field with no insects at all, because the pollinators that are there, they do improve your yield. And that yield improvement can be at least 10 to 15% or more, depending on the study you look at. So you really need to know what your levels of cabbage seed pod weevil are. Take a net, do some sweeping, see if you're above a threshold. If you aren't, and you spray for them anyway, you could inadvertently be decreasing your yield potential by negating that pollinator effect.
Right. And you were actually saying there's some beneficial, or at least some seed pod weevils that weren't affecting our crops. There's quite a few species in Manitoba as well.
So so cabbage seed pod weevil, they belong to a group of weevils called the minute seed weevils, which are tiny little weevils that feed on seeds. Not all of them are crop pests. In fact, most of them aren't crop pests. And weevils in general, we have weevils that are actually beneficial. There's weevils that have been introduced to feed on weeds. That's all they do. And so there's good weevils, there's the ones that are just there that don't do any economic harm, and then there's the few that do economic harm. So not all weevils are bad weevils.
So is the cabbage seed pod weevil maybe more difficult to identify from the more less damaging ones?
It is a tricky one to identify. Now, if you know what you're doing with experience, it can become easy. But it is a small weevil for one. It's 3 to 4 millimeters, so tiny. It's gray, and their natural response to avoid being eaten is to play dead. So when you catch them in a sweep net and you dump the contents into something to look at, they may play dead for a few seconds on you, in which case they may look like just a speck of dirt. Okay. Again, they're tiny, 3 to 4 millimeters, gray. They could look like a speck of dirt until they start moving. So you have to look careful and know what you're looking for.
You showed one thing in your slide too that had to do with seed timing. Now, farmers can't always control that when it comes to cabbage seed pod weevil. You have to more base that on weather in many conditions. But what did they see there in terms of seeding time compared to the amount of cabbage seed pod weevils that were present later?
Yeah, so the thing to note here is that they overwinter as an adult. When those adults start coming out in the spring, they're really highly attracted to the color yellow, very highly attracted to the color yellow. What often happens is they end up being much more prevalent at the earliest seeded canola in an area. They seem to be able to seek it out. Somebody in Alberta did do a proper study on the impact of seeding date and cabbage seed pod weevil populations. They seeded at 3 different dates: late April, early May, late May, and there was a really strong correlation between seeding date and cabbage seed pod weevil numbers. The earlier seeded fields had a lot more than the later seeded fields. Okay. Just because, again, first yellow on the landscape, and they're drawn to it. So yeah, if a person wants to, I guess, reduce their risk somewhat, what they can do is let your neighbors seed first and seed a bit later, and
right.
Yeah.
Hope it all works out.
Yeah.
Other than cabbage seed pod weevil, is there any other insect concerns we might have for 2026 in Manitoba?
Well, we did have some issues with Bertha armyworm this year. So it's a caterpillar that feeds on the leaves, but will feed on the pods as well. Our issues last year were more in the western region and the western part of the central region. So from about Nipawa westward was the problem areas. Okay. They do overwinter as a pupa here. If you have even a little bit of snow, it insulates them well enough that they should be able to survive well. So Bertha armyworm, definitely one to watch for next year. Diamondback moth, we had some populations blow in last year. They were an issue more in the eastern part of the province, so Beausejour and kind of that eastern region, maybe southern Interlake. A lot depends on where the winds bring them and drop them.
Sure.
So we can't predict that one accurately well in advance because, again, they come in on the winds. So it's always one to watch for. And canola, you always got to keep your eyes open for flea beetles. Right. That's a given. We have chronically high populations. There wasn't as much foliar spraying last year as the past few years, but I think the reason for that was we had good enough soil moisture that the crop could get germination and early growth going. We had some really warm weather in May, so the crop went from the seedling to several leaves quickly this past year, which minimized the opportunity for flea beetles to do a lot of damage. All you need is a year where it's excessively dry or cool, maybe a frost, anything that delays that early growth, and you're at a higher risk of flea beetles being an issue. So we lucked out a bit this year, but certainly one we need to keep an eye on.
Okay. So the biggest takeaway I heard today was scout for cabbage seed pod weevil. I said it correctly this time. And anything else you want to leave us with today?
Well, I always like to wrap up by just reinforcing what you just said. Scout, scout, scout. That's right. The main thing. Make informed decisions. Don't just manage an insect or apply an insecticide just in case it's there. Yeah. Again, that can do more harm than good economically, environmentally, in many ways. Scout. That's the main message.
Perfect. Great. Good to see you again at Ag Days, John.
Good to see you.
Have a good show.
Thanks.